Faced with the choice of raising my daughter in mainland China or the USA, I knew which was the right choice. You see, China does have a very robust education system, but unfortunately it comes along with a huge amount of brainwashing. And I thought, what better way to discuss this than to speak to a Western woman who grew up and went to school in mainland China.
The Red Dragon's going to do what the Red Dragon wants to do. And having grown up in China, I spent 18 years of my life living under CCP rule as a child, as a foreigner.
Now, I mean, me personally, I lived in China for 14 and a half years. So, I've been there long enough to see what's going on. I also, of course, taught English and, taught in kindergartens, in middle schools, and then I moved on to, did some high school stuff. Then I also taught adults and business English and stuff, and eventually moved on to teaching doctors. So I've seen the whole education system there, and I'm curious, how was your education? Did you go to a public school, or were you in like international private schools?
Well, yeah, I was in the international circuit, obviously starting out because my level of Mandarin was 0 going in, so I couldn't go to a public school because I would have failed on the premise of purely not understanding anything.
Right.
So I went to an international kindergarten, and then until my Chinese level was sufficient. And then I went to a Chinese public school for a year, but because I was so traumatized from the experience, having gone from an American school, which is pretty much, the equivalent of any school you'd find in the U.S. Sort of the way that, I'm not talking about standards and stuff, because, obviously there's a difference between private and public and even in states, but the way that they teach you to be a critical thinker. You can challenge a teacher. Yeah. You can debate with a teacher. In the Chinese school system, you say, yes, 老师, no, 老师.
Yeah.
How high do you want me to jump, 老师? It's like a robot. They beat creativity out of you.
Yeah.
They beat independent thinking and critical analysis out of you.
Yeah, that's very true.
You're not allowed to be a nonconformist. You're praised for being a yes man and for bowing down to the system. And if it was a good system, I would not condone that, but I would still say, okay, I can understand the rationale because most people are sheep. I call them sheeple. People who conform and people who, usually got the 9 to 5 and overextend a mortgage and they don't think for themselves. They absorb whatever shit is on TV, on the news without questioning. Those are sheeple. And the Chinese communist system rewards you for being a sheep.
Yeah.
And I couldn't adjust.
Yeah.
So, my parents took me out and I finished my schooling in the international school system. Good. But even so, the international school system in China is interesting because they charge you astronomical fees to, there's a lot of Chinese students who get put into that system if their parents can afford it because they would like to go. It's a passage into a U.S. college. They do the PSAT, the SAT, whereas in Chinese schools, you'd be very hard pressed to find a child who's gone through the public system in China and then, with his Chinese diploma is able to get admission into U.S. college because the systems are not compatible. So, because the majority of kids who had gone to those schools and the school was still partially owned by China because there's always a monopoly on it, whether it's private or public, they did teach us a completely incorrect, fabricated version of history, for example.
Okay. Can you give me an example of the fabricated history they would teach you?
Oh, yeah. They were telling us that Mao Zedong, decided to, how did they put this? Let me just try to think back. This was in 8th grade. Oh, yeah. He had traveled to America at the time, and he had realized that America was evil.
Okay.
And that is why, America was evil. And the Guaylo, or the Waiguoren, as we call it, they're evil. They're evil people. China is the real, the real freedom is to be found within the Chinese system. And the real freedom of thinking and the freedom of expression and movement and sexuality and all that we take for granted stateside or in Western democratic societies, that is, only to be found. That is all false. The Western people are slaves to their government. The Chinese system, is the only system that allows freedom. So we were completely brainwashed.
Right.
We were told that the guy who broke away from mainland to set up in Taiwan, we were told that he was a traitor and a spy that the CIA had implanted, into China, and that the whole of Taiwan was overrun with CIA agents. And, it was just the most bizarre experience, because I had obviously gone on to study stateside. I'd lived stateside. I did my undergrad, postgrad, and of course, people would be talking to me about, where I'm from and stuff, and I would start telling them, the Chinese society, is like this and that, and they were like, what?
Yeah, exactly.
They were like, what the hell is she talking about?
Wow.
Taiwan isn't overrun by CIA agents, and, like, what the hell is she? So at the end of the day, I had to relearn, because I'd been taught lies from the age of 4 through to the age of 18 in terms of history.
Yeah, that's terrible.
My entire understanding of the world was warped.
Yeah, because
that's a crime against humanity, actually.
Yeah, that's what they do. They get them young. They just pump people full of this information, and unfortunately, when there's no one to challenge that, it gets stuck in your head. And the big issue is you've got the Chinese government closing off the Western media, so they block the internet. They don't allow any Western news to get in there. So when you grow up and you hear this stuff and you never have anyone challenge that, you just take it as truth. Yeah, it's really
and it's not only that. That's a good point, but it's social conditioning, or as you would call soft power. They're so successful. That's why I always say that the Western world is not equipped or prepared to deal with the level of psychological manipulation. It's almost borderline narcissistic.
Yeah.
And I don't mean narcissistic as in let's take a selfie. I mean narcissistic personality disorder. People think and act like the way the CCP does. Sociopaths think and act the way the CCP does. They gaslight and ostracize and triangulate people, so that if there's somebody who thinks differently or who questions their, whatever they're lying about, they would set everybody else off against that person in order to attack, bully, ostracize, manipulate them, so that in order for them to feel sane, they have to change and conform to those lies. Because if they don't, their life will be made miserable by the people around them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a terrible thing. It's something that I experience all the time. Well, at least they try it on me. They just don't seem to realize that, being South African, it just doesn't work on me. The more you try to
but
push
if
me.
If you don't eventually get out, it will lead to a level of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. I mean, look, I left China for that specific reason, because they were targeting my family. They were constantly harassing me online. They were harassing my parents in South Africa even, trying to, they were sending them emails. They contacted all the businesses in the area where my parents live, because my parents have a public business, so it's easy to find them by searching their names. So they contacted all the businesses in the area and were sending them emails saying that my parents are racist and, their son is a criminal in China and a spy and all this crap, And so my parents, like friends who run a pizza shop or whatever, be like, what's going on? Why are we getting all these messages saying that you guys are XYZ, And they even sent emails to the EFF and the ANC to say my parents are like racists and their son is a racist in China and a spy. They've tried all these tricks, and it would usually work on a Chinese citizen because they get intimidated and they shut up. But that didn't work on me, unfortunately. It just made me angrier,
Yes.
Crazy stuff.
That is insane. But you know what? I wouldn't put it past them. And I think what happened with you is that it takes a specific sort of alpha personality type, whether that's an alpha male or alpha female, which I think both of us have a majority of those traits. Whereas when you push a person in a certain direction, they can go one of two ways. They can either secede or they can fight back. And the ones who do fight back are up against an enormous, insurmountable odds, whether it's manipulation, intimidation, threats. These people will stop at absolutely nothing to, suppress the truth of what is going on in China and how they're, dealing with their own citizens. And the fact that, I grew up there and I lived there and I've seen these things, and you obviously also have your history there. I think the world really has to see it for what it is. especially, because China has a lot of influence in the Western sphere. They own almost half of Australia. They have a significant share in American agriculture, IT, a lot of different industries, manufacturing, exporting. And I do believe that, we should be buying American, making American, bringing those jobs back stateside. I don't think that, we need to cut China off at the root. And, cutting them off where it hurts means cutting off their access to Western businesses, to Western supplies, and cutting off their easy access to immigration, especially to the States.
I agree with you. It's a tough situation we find ourselves in because, like you say, if you try to go against them, they're very good at manipulating the system, and they will do things like if you start to make noise, they'll go after your employer and put complaints against you, get you fired. They can do that. I mean, I'm in a very lucky situation, even though it's not very stable, where I work for myself. So they can't try to get me fired, so to speak. So I can just continue to do it, no matter how much they try to intimidate me or whatever. It's just not going to work. But the immigration thing is definitely something that needs to be looked at. And I think specifically because as far as China is concerned, if you try to immigrate to China, you can't. It's just not possible. You can live there, and there are various visas that you can, obtain. But they keep moving the goalposts when it comes to these visas. And on top of that, you can never really become a Chinese citizen. Whereas any Chinese citizen can come to the US or Australia and marry someone, or at least, invest or do something. And a couple of years down the line, they have their citizenship and all the rights. But China doesn't offer the same back to anyone. And just to add to that, people don't seem to realize that many Chinese citizens are still always fiercely loyal to the CCP. So even though they obtain a citizenship of another country, they don't really embrace it. They don't really want to become, I'm saying the majority, and obviously there are tons of exceptions to this rule, but from my experiences, even though they have an Australian citizenship or a Canadian citizenship or an American citizenship, they see it as a tool rather than, a new life. They still maintain their Chinese identity and their loyalty to the CCP above all else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's always good to hear first-hand experiences from people who've actually been there and done that. So it's really good to hear from someone who grew up in China, in mainland China, and went to school there. Next time, let's talk about the Hong Kong security law, since you have a lot of insight into that, and I'm looking forward to it. So, guys, for those of you listening to this, I want to thank you for watching, and, as usual, the drill. Stay awesome.